At 04:45 on the morning of July 7th, 1944, Private First Class John Sidur pressed himself deeper into his foxhole on Saipan and listened to the silence. The silence was worse than the probing attacks. The silence meant they were coming. Sidur was 19 years old, from Troy, New York, serving with 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. His battalion held a thinly stretched line on the Tanapag Plain in northern Saipan, backs to the ocean, facing the last Japanese positions on the island. For 3 hours, Japanese troops had been probing American lines, testing for weaknesses, searching for gaps. Small groups would emerge from the darkness, probe forward, then withdraw. The pattern had repeated dozens of times. Every veteran of Pacific fighting knew what it meant. Banzai charge, massive human wave attack, thousands of men screaming and dying in a desperate final assault. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The probing stopped at 0440. Complete silence fell over the battlefield. In the darkness, Sidur could hear his own breathing. He could hear men shifting in foxholes nearby. He could hear the ocean behind him. But from the Japanese lines ahead, nothing. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien moved along the 1st Battalion line, checking positions, encouraging his men. O'Brien was 44 years old, a veteran who had enlisted as a private in 1917 during World War I and worked his way up through the ranks over 27 years. His men called him Obi. He was described as a cocky little rooster of a man who couldn't stand still. He chain-smoked cigarettes and talked constantly, moving from position to position, making sure his troops were ready. O'Brien knew his battalion was in desperate shape. 1st Battalion held the westernmost section of the American line, about 250 yards from the beach. Major Edward McCarthy's 2nd Battalion extended from 1st Battalion's left flank all the way to the water. Together, the two battalions had to defend a front stretching over 1,000 yards. They had fewer than 1,200 men fit for combat. Intelligence estimated at least 4,000 Japanese troops were massed in the northern corner of the island, backs against the sea, nowhere left to retreat. O'Brien knew the mathematics. 4,000 attacking, 1,200 defending, 3-to-1 odds. Worse, there was a gap between 1st and 2nd Battalion, a seam in the line. O'Brien had requested reinforcements to fill the gap, but none were available. Every unit on Saipan was committed. He positioned his anti-tank weapons to cover the gap as best he could and hoped it would be enough. In the Japanese lines, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito sat in his command cave in Paradise Valley and composed his final orders. Saito was 54 years old, commander of all Japanese forces on Saipan. 3 weeks of fighting had reduced his garrison from 32,000 men to fewer than 5,000. Most were wounded. All were exhausted and starving. American naval bombardment and artillery fire pounded Japanese positions continuously. There was no food, no ammunition, no hope of reinforcement or rescue. The Imperial Japanese Navy had tried to relieve Saipan in mid-June. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had resulted in catastrophic Japanese losses. 3 aircraft carriers sunk, over 600 aircraft destroyed. The battle became known to Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. No relief was coming. Saipan was lost, but Lieutenant General Saito refused to surrender. Japanese military doctrine emphasized dying with honor over surrendering in shame. The concept of gyokusai, meaning shattered jewel, glorified death in battle as the ultimate expression of loyalty to the emperor. Saito ordered every man capable of walking to participate in a final Banzai charge. Officers would lead from the front. The wounded would follow. Even civilians would be expected to attack with bamboo spears. The goal was not victory. Victory was impossible. The goal was to die honorably while killing as many Americans as possible. Saito distributed the last of the sake and beer to his troops. Japanese soldiers drank heavily through the night, building courage for what they knew would be their last battle. Officers sharpened their swords and prepared to lead the charge, screaming the battle cry, Tenoheika Banzai. Long live His Majesty the Emperor. At 0300, Saito transmitted his final message to Tokyo. We deeply apologize to the Emperor that we cannot do better than we are doing. We are going to seek death. Then he ordered the attack to begin. The Banzai charge was not a new tactic. Japanese forces had used mass infantry assaults throughout the Pacific War. The tactic had specific tactical logic in certain situations. In early battles, when Japanese forces still had numerical superiority and the element of surprise, Banzai charges sometimes succeeded in overwhelming American positions. At the Battle of the Tenaru on Guadalcanal in August 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 800 men in a night attack against American positions. The attack failed catastrophically. American machine guns and defensive positions cut down the attackers. Ichiki committed suicide afterward. In May 1943, at the Battle of Attu in the Aleutian Islands, Colonel Yasuo Yamasaki led the final Japanese defenders in a Banzai charge after running out of food and ammunition. The attack briefly penetrated American lines, but was ultimately repulsed, with almost all Japanese attackers killed. By July 1944, American forces understood Banzai charge tactics thoroughly. Commanders knew to watch for the warning signs, increased probing attacks, sudden silence before the assault, the distinctive battle cry. Defensive procedures became standardized. Mass ammunition in each foxhole, fixed bayonets, sharpened knives, position machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, call for artillery support, prepare flares to illuminate the battlefield. The tactics worked. Banzai charges consistently failed to achieve tactical success. Attackers suffered catastrophic casualties, usually over 90% killed. Defenders suffered casualties but maintained their positions, but Banzai charges continued because Japanese military culture valued death in battle over survival in defeat. For commanders like Lieutenant General Saito, ordering a Banzai charge was choosing how to die, not attempting to win. The attack on Saipan would be the largest Banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. Over 4,000 men attacking across open ground against prepared defensive positions supported by tanks, artillery, and naval gunfire. The outcome was inevitable, but the scale of violence over the next 15 hours would be unprecedented. At 04:45, the silence ended. Captain Sakai Oba led the first wave of Japanese officers forward. Unlike many Japanese commanders who committed suicide in their command posts while their men died, Oba and 200 other officers placed themselves in the front rank of the attack. They drew their swords, raised them overhead, and charged toward the American lines, screaming at the top of their lungs. Behind them came thousands of soldiers. The able-bodied men came first, armed with rifles, bayonets, and hand grenades. Behind them came the walking wounded, limping forward on crutches or supporting each other, many unarmed. Behind them came civilians carrying sharpened bamboo spears. The mass of humanity poured forward through the darkness like a human tsunami. Major McCarthy of the 2nd Battalion described the attack as looking like a cattle stampede from a Western movie, except the Japanese just kept coming. The attackers hit the gap between 1st and 2nd Battalion exactly as O'Brien had feared. Thousands of screaming men poured through the seam in the American line. Private Sidur saw the massive attackers emerge from the darkness and opened fire with his M1 Garand rifle. 8 rounds, reload, 8 more rounds. The men around him fired continuously. Machine guns hammered at the advancing horde, but there were too many. For every Japanese soldier who fell, 3 more kept coming. The Japanese charge broke through the American front line in multiple locations. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted across a front over 1,000 yards wide. Japanese soldiers wielding bayonets and swords clashed with American soldiers using rifles as clubs after exhausting their ammunition. Men grappled in the darkness, bodies piled up. The fighting was primal and desperate. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien moved through the chaos with a pistol in each hand, firing at Japanese soldiers, shouting encouragement to his men. "Don't give up an inch. Hold the line." His presence steadied the troops around him. When O'Brien was there, men fought harder, held longer. O'Brien exhausted both pistols, dropped them, and grabbed a Jeep-mounted 50 caliber machine gun. He stood, fully exposed, firing into the mass of attackers. Bullets snapped past him. A round struck his shoulder, The impact spun him sideways, but he stayed at the gun, continuing to fire. Blood soaked his uniform. He ignored it. Around O'Brien's position, bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep. The 50 caliber machine gun was a devastating weapon at close range. The heavy bullets tore through multiple targets, but the attackers kept coming. O'Brien's machine gun went silent. Out of ammunition, Japanese soldiers swarmed the position. O'Brien died fighting, at least 30 enemy bodies scattered around his gun. His final stand had bought precious minutes for other troops to reorganize. The Japanese breakthrough continued southward. The attackers overran American positions and reached the 10th Marine Artillery Battery, positioned behind the 105th Infantry. Marines were firing their 105mm howitzers in direct fire mode, line of sight, at point-blank range into the attacking waves. Each howitzer round created massive casualties, but still the Japanese came forward. The Marines destroyed their guns to prevent capture and fell back fighting. Some 105th Infantry soldiers found themselves cut off by the Japanese advance, with no way to retreat except into the ocean. They swam to American destroyers offshore. The ships pulled men from the water while providing naval gunfire support to troops still fighting on land. By 0600, the Japanese had advanced over 1,000 yards and threatened to split the American lines completely. If the breakthrough continued, the entire northern beachhead could collapse. American commanders threw every available unit into the counterattack. Marines from the reserve divisions moved forward. Army reinforcements arrived. Tanks maneuvered into position. Artillery fire concentrated on the Japanese advance. Among the reinforcements were flamethrower tanks, 24 M3A1 Stuart light tanks converted to carry Canadian Ronson flamethrowers. The Marines called them Satans. The Satans had been improvised in Hawaii specifically for the Marianas operation by Army and Navy mechanics from the Chemical Warfare Service. The conversion was simple but effective. Remove the 37mm main gun. Install a flamethrower nozzle in the bow machine gun position. Add internal fuel tanks. The result was a mobile flamethrower with armor protection. Each Satan carried enough fuel for about 80 seconds of continuous flame projection at a range of 60 to 80 yards. The Satans had been used primarily for clearing bunkers and caves during the initial phases of the Saipan campaign. But on July 7th, they were deployed against massed infantry. The results were devastating. The flame projector shot a stream of napalm-thickened gasoline that ignited on contact. The burning fuel stuck to everything it touched: uniforms, skin, vegetation. The flames created temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Men caught in the flame died instantly or suffered horrific burns. The psychological impact was as important as the physical effect. Japanese soldiers who had charged forward with suicidal determination broke and ran when flamethrower tanks appeared. The Satans advanced alongside M4 Sherman medium tanks and infantry, systematically destroying Japanese concentrations. Tank infantry coordination had improved throughout the Saipan campaign. Infantry protected tanks from close-range attacks. Tanks provided mobile firepower and protection for infantry. The combination was lethal. By 0800, American forces had stabilized the line and begun pushing the Japanese back. By 1200 hours, the counterattack had recaptured all lost ground. By 1800 hours, the battlefield was secure. The carnage was indescribable. Japanese bodies lay in windows across the Tanapag plain. The body count in front of the 105th Infantry's positions was 2,295. Another 2,016 Japanese dead were counted to the rear. Total Japanese casualties exceeded 4,300 killed. Almost every man who participated in the Banzai charge died. American casualties were also severe. The 1st and 2nd battalions of the 105th Infantry had been nearly destroyed. 406 killed, 512 wounded. Nearly 1,000 men casualties out of 1,200 engaged. The 105th Infantry had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. 7 men were awarded Medals of Honor for actions on Saipan, all posthumously. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien received the Medal of Honor for his heroic leadership from June 20th through July 7th. Private First Class Thomas Baker received the Medal of Honor for his actions during the July 7th attack. After exhausting his ammunition, Baker used his rifle as a club, breaking it apart on Japanese attackers before being overwhelmed. Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, a dentist serving as a medical officer, was initially denied the Medal of Honor because he had used a machine gun to defend his aid station, violating Geneva Convention restrictions on medical personnel using crew-served weapons. His Medal of Honor was finally approved in 2002, 58 years after his death. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 2 days later, on July 9, 1944, Saipan was officially declared secure. But the horror did not end. Japanese propaganda had convinced civilians that Americans would torture, rape, and murder anyone captured. Hundreds of Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than surrender. At the northern cliffs of Saipan, entire families jumped to their deaths. Parents threw children off cliffs before jumping themselves. Other families huddled around grenades provided by Japanese soldiers and detonated them. Some simply walked into the ocean until the waves swallowed them. American troops attempted to stop the suicides. They used loudspeakers with captured Japanese civilians, urging their compatriots to surrender, promising food and medical care. Some civilians were convinced and survived, but approximately 1,000 civilians died by suicide in the final days of the battle. The sites where mass suicides occurred became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. Today, they are recognized as historic sites on the U.S. National Register of Historic Places, memorials to the terrible human cost of fanatical military indoctrination. The Battle of Saipan marked a turning point in the Pacific War. For the first time, American forces had captured territory that Japan considered part of the home islands. Saipan had been under Japanese control since 1914 and heavily colonized with Japanese civilians. Its loss placed the Japanese home islands within range of B-29 Superfortress bombers. American heavy bombers operating from Saipan could reach Tokyo, Osaka, and other major Japanese cities. The strategic implications were overwhelming. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo had publicly promised that Saipan would never fall. When it did, his government collapsed. Tojo resigned on July 18, 1944, taking responsibility for the disaster. The flamethrower tanks proved their value during the Saipan campaign, but the M3A1 Satan had significant limitations. The light tank chassis was vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank weapons. The fuel capacity was insufficient for sustained operations. The flamethrower installation interfered with crew positions and radio equipment. After Saipan, American forces began developing improved flamethrower tanks based on the M4 Sherman medium tank. The POA CWS designs featured better armor, greater fuel capacity, and main gun-mounted flamethrowers with longer range. These improved flamethrower tanks saw extensive use at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. At Iwo Jima, in February and March 1945, 8 M4A3 Sherman flamethrower tanks, equipped with Navy Mark I flamethrowers, proved to be among the most valuable weapons on the island. The Marines called them Zippos. One CB electrician's mate, who operated a Zippo tank on Iwo Jima for 20 days, wrote, "One day, we were assigned a pocket to burn out. We did in 6 hours with 4 loads of fuel. What a tank battalion and 3 infantry companies had been trying to do for 5 days. Over 600 flamethrower attacks using more than 200,000 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel were conducted on Iwo Jima. The flamethrowers were particularly effective against Japanese cave positions that were impervious to conventional weapons. At Okinawa in April through June 1945, an entire Army flamethrower tank battalion was deployed, the largest single use of flamethrower tanks in World War II. The Banzai charge tactic continued through the final months of the war, but with diminishing frequency. Japanese commanders recognized that massed infantry attacks against prepared American positions with superior firepower were suicidal and tactically useless. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, explicitly forbid Banzai charges for most of the battle. He ordered his troops to fight from fortified positions and make Americans pay for every yard of ground. Only near the end, when defeat was certain, did local commanders organize Banzai charges against Kuribayashi's orders. The lesson from Saipan was clear. Japanese soldiers were willing to die with incredible determination. But determination alone could not overcome overwhelming American advantages in firepower, logistics, and technology. Every Banzai charge ended the same way. Japanese forces annihilated, American positions held. The tactic achieved nothing except demonstrating the horrific human cost of military indoctrination that valued death over survival. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien's leadership during the July 7th attack exemplified the courage of American soldiers who stood against overwhelming odds. He refused to abandon his men. He stayed on the front line despite being wounded. He continued fighting until he was killed. His sacrifice and the sacrifice of hundreds of his soldiers bought time for reinforcements to arrive and stopped the Japanese breakthrough. Private Baker's determination to keep fighting, even after running out of ammunition, using his rifle as a club until it broke apart, showed the same spirit. These men did not seek heroic deaths. They fought because their comrades were fighting. They died protecting the men beside them. The Battle of Saipan cost American forces 3,426 killed and 10,364 wounded. Japanese forces lost approximately 29,000 killed, including approximately 5,000 suicides by military and civilian personnel. The disparity in casualties reflected the fundamental imbalance between the two forces by mid-1944. American advantages in firepower, air support, naval gunfire, logistics, and reinforcements had become overwhelming. The tactical innovations of Banzai charges could not overcome strategic realities, but understanding the Saipan Banzai charge requires understanding the context. Japanese soldiers were not mindless fanatics. They were men trapped by military doctrine that offered no honorable alternative to death. Surrender meant eternal shame for themselves and their families. Better to die fighting than live in disgrace. This belief system, combined with propaganda about American atrocities, created the conditions for mass suicide attacks. American forces developed effective countermeasures through experience and superior firepower. Machine guns, artillery, tanks, and flamethrowers created defensive positions that could withstand massed infantry attacks. Tank infantry coordination improved continuously throughout the Pacific Campaign. By 1945, American forces could defeat Banzai charges with minimal casualties through proper defensive preparation. The flamethrower tank emerged as one of the most effective weapons for Pacific Island warfare. Its ability to clear bunkers, caves, and trenches made it invaluable for reducing Japanese defensive positions. The psychological impact of the weapon forced Japanese soldiers to abandon positions they would otherwise have defended to the death. But the flamethrower remained controversial. The weapon inflicted horrific deaths. Burning men alive violated fundamental human instincts about honorable combat. Operators of flamethrower tanks and portable flamethrowers often struggled psychologically with what they had done. The weapon was effective precisely because it was so terrible. The story of Saipan is ultimately about men facing impossible situations and choosing to fight anyway. O'Brien and his battalion knew they were outnumbered and facing a desperate enemy. They fought because there was no alternative. The Japanese soldiers who charged into American machine gun fire knew they would die. They charged because their culture and military training left them no other choice they could live with. The civilians who jumped from cliffs believed American propaganda about torture and death. They died because lies had convinced them death was better than surrender. War creates these situations. Good men die defending their comrades. Desperate men charge into certain death. Innocent civilians die because they've been lied to. The weapons become more efficient, the casualties mount, and, in the end, the only winners are the ones who survive to remember the dead. The lesson endures 80 years later. Courage in combat means standing with your comrades when every instinct screams to run. Leadership means refusing to abandon your troops even when wounded and dying. Sacrifice means giving your life so others might live. These truths remained constant, whether the battle was fought with rifles and bayonets in 1944 or with modern weapons today. The technology changes. The fundamental human experiences of combat do not. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The broader implications of the Saipan Banzai charge extended far beyond the tactical outcome. The battle demonstrated conclusively that Japanese defensive doctrine had failed to adapt to changing realities. In 1942 and early 1943, when Japanese forces still possessed numerical advantages and operated from fortified positions with secure supply lines, aggressive tactics sometimes succeeded. By mid-1944, those conditions no longer existed. American industrial production had created overwhelming material superiority. A single American infantry division carried more firepower than an entire Japanese army. American logistics could supply forces anywhere in the Pacific. Japanese supply lines were strangled by submarine warfare and air superiority. The flamethrower tanks deployed at Saipan represented this industrial and technological advantage. 24 Satan tanks were improvised in Hawaii in a matter of weeks. Mechanics from the Chemical Warfare Service and Navy Seabees converted M3A1 Stuart light tanks using Canadian Ronson flamethrower equipment. The conversion required removing the 37mm gun, installing fuel tanks, and mounting the flame projector, simple modifications that American industrial capacity could accomplish quickly. Japan possessed no equivalent capability. Japanese forces had developed Type 93 and Type 100 flamethrowers for infantry use, but these were man-portable weapons with limited range and fuel capacity. Japanese industry never developed flamethrower tanks because resources were dedicated to producing conventional weapons that were already obsolete against American firepower. The Satan tanks, despite their limitations, proved effective in multiple roles during the Saipan campaign. Initially deployed for bunker and cave clearing operations, they adapted quickly to other uses. Against the July 7th Banzai charge, Satans provided mobile firepower that could engage massed infantry while remaining protected from small arms fire. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese soldiers who had been indoctrinated to accept death in battle still recoiled from the flamethrower's horrific effects. This psychological advantage was as valuable as the physical casualties inflicted. The 70 to 80-yard effective range of the Satan's flamethrower meant the tanks had to close to dangerous distances. Japanese soldiers armed with magnetic mines could disable tanks by attaching explosives to vulnerable points, like fuel tanks or tracks. Several Satans were damaged or destroyed this way during the Saipan campaign. But the diesel fuel used in M3A1 tanks proved less flammable than gasoline. Several tanks survived magnetic mine attacks that would have incinerated gasoline-fueled vehicles. The experience at Saipan drove rapid improvements in flamethrower tank design. Engineers recognized that the M3A1 Stuart chassis was too lightly armored and carried insufficient fuel. The solution was mounting flamethrowers on M4 Sherman medium tanks. The Sherman's thicker armor provided better protection. The larger hull could carry more fuel, extending operational time. The Sherman's more powerful engine could handle the additional weight. By early 1945, Marine and Army units were equipped with POA CWS flamethrower Shermans that could project flame up to 150 yards and carry enough fuel for multiple extended engagements. These improved vehicles dominated at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The human cost of the July 7th Banzai charge was staggering but not unprecedented in Pacific Island fighting. At Tarawa, in November 1943, American forces suffered over 3,000 casualties, capturing an island of less than 3 square miles. At Peleliu, in September 1944, the 1st Marine Division suffered over 60% casualties. The pattern was consistent. Japanese forces fought from prepared positions until overrun, then launched final Banzai charges that achieved nothing except death. The 105th Infantry Regiment's near destruction at Saipan was exceptional only in the concentration of casualties over a few hours. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien's leadership during those hours exemplified the difference between surviving and prevailing in impossible situations. O'Brien had every justification to pull back when wounded. He could have directed the defense from a safer position. Instead, he stayed at the front, manning the .50 caliber machine gun, continuing to fight until killed. His visible presence and refusal to retreat steadied troops who might otherwise have broken. The 30 Japanese bodies found around his position testified to his effectiveness. But, more importantly, O'Brien's sacrifice bought minutes that allowed adjacent units to reorganize and reinforcements to arrive. Those minutes made the difference between containing the breakthrough and complete collapse. Private Baker's actions carried the same significance. After exhausting his rifle ammunition, Baker could have withdrawn. Instead, he used his rifle as a club, fighting hand-to-hand until the weapon broke apart. He was last seen propped against a tree, asking to be left behind with a pistol loaded with 8 rounds. When his position was recaptured, 8 Japanese bodies surrounded him, 1 bullet expended for each. These were not men seeking death. These were men who refused to abandon their comrades and understood their sacrifice might save others. The Japanese perspective was fundamentally different. For soldiers, like those in the Banzai charge, death was not sacrifice, but obligation. The concept of gyokusai meant that choosing death over surrender was not heroic, but expected. Japanese military culture eliminated the distinction between tactical withdrawal and shameful defeat. Once a position became untenable, commanders had only 2 options: counterattack and die, or commit suicide. Surrendering was not considered. This cultural framework trapped Japanese commanders in tactical situations that Western military doctrine would recognize as lost. At Saipan, Lieutenant General Saito commanded a force that was starving out of ammunition, with no hope of reinforcement. Western military doctrine would consider surrender under these circumstances as acceptable. Japanese doctrine made surrender unthinkable. The result was 4,000 men dying in a futile attack that accomplished nothing except demonstrating their willingness to die. The civilian suicides at Saipan revealed the broader tragedy of Japanese military indoctrination. Japanese propaganda had convinced civilians that Americans were savage barbarians who would torture and murder prisoners. Mothers believed throwing their children off cliffs was merciful. Compared to capture, families believed death together was preferable to American occupation. These beliefs were lies, but they were believed absolutely. When American troops attempted to save civilians by announcing surrender terms over loudspeakers, many civilians refused because they thought it was a trap. The propaganda was so effective that civilians chose death over testing whether Americans would actually treat them humanely. The Saipan campaign cost Japan more than territory and troops. The political consequences destroyed Tojo's government. The strategic consequences placed Japan's home islands under direct bomber attack for the first time. B-29 superfortresses operating from Saipan would eventually drop over 90,000 tons of bombs on Japanese cities. The psychological consequences shattered Japanese confidence in ultimate victory. After Saipan, Japanese military planning shifted from winning the war to making invasion of the home islands so costly that America would negotiate peace. The lesson from the July 7th Banzai charge was clear to all participants. Japanese determination could not overcome American firepower. Courage could not defeat industrial capacity. Willingness to die did not equal ability to win. These lessons shaped the final year of the Pacific War. Japanese forces at Iwo Jima and Okinawa fought from fortified positions. Rather than launching mass charges, they inflicted maximum casualties by making Americans dig them out of caves and bunkers. This strategy was more effective than Banzai charges, but equally futile. American forces adapted by using flamethrower tanks demolitions, and overwhelming firepower. The result was the same. Japanese garrisons destroyed, American forces victorious. The difference was that defensive tactics cost Americans more casualties, delaying but not preventing victory. The flamethrower tanks that helped stop the Saipan Banzai charge became standard equipment for the rest of the war. Their effectiveness in destroying fortified positions made them essential for Pacific Island operations. But the weapon remained controversial among both users and targets. Its effectiveness derived from its horror. That remains true of many weapons. Their value in achieving military objectives must be weighed against their human cost. At Saipan, the cost was measured in thousands of dead from both sides and hundreds of civilians who died believing lies. The victory secured American strategic advantage in the Pacific, but could not erase the waste of human life. 80 years later, the cliffs where civilians died remain as memorials. The beaches where Marines landed are national historic landmarks. The battlefield where the Banzai charge occurred is marked by monuments to both sides. These places remind us that war's human cost transcends victory or defeat. Courage and sacrifice occurred on both sides. Men fought bravely for causes both just and unjust. Technology and tactics evolved through bitter experience, and in the end, the dead remained dead, regardless of which side prevailed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.